Hey there, fellow travelers. Tim from Secret Fire Books here. I mentioned in my most recent reading report video that I wanted to start talking about manga here on the channel. Manga is actually something that I'm very interested in. I have been reading and collecting it ever since I was a kid, and I haven't read that much of it lately. I don't even think I've bought a single volume of manga in almost a year or so, but it is still something that I'm very interested in. I wanted to jump back into reading it and talk about it with you guys. So I figured that the best way to do that would be to jump back into a reread of my favorite series, which is Fullmetal Alchemist by Hiromu Arakawa. This series was originally published in the Japanese magazine Monthly Shonen Gangan between the years 2001 and 2010, so that's almost a decade's worth of material. They were all bound up into 27 of these individual volumes, and it is fantastic. Aside from being my personal favorite manga of all time, I would dare say that this is one of the greatest fantasy stories ever written. I know that's a pretty bold claim, but hopefully by the end of this video, I will have stated my case for you guys. The thing is, I find it kind of hard to recommend this series, at least to people who have never read manga before, because if I'm being honest, the quality, or rather the tone of the series is all over the place, at least in the first half of this series. And to prove my point, I will show you the first image that you see as you open Volume 1 of Fullmetal Alchemist. This is literally the first thing that meets your eyes upon cracking open Chapter 1, Volume 1 of Fullmetal Alchemist. And that is a screaming, weeping 12-year-old child with a severed leg writhing in a pool of his own blood. That is what you see as soon as you open this book. And the funny thing is that aside from that bit of stark grotesqueness, the rest of this first volume of the series is a pretty light-hearted, jaunty action adventure. And so right off the bat, you see a dramatic shift in tone. And it kind of stays that way. It is consistently inconsistent for about the first half of the series. But before I get too far in it, I should give some context and explain the overall setting and the story of the series. The world of Fullmetal Alchemist is essentially a parallel version of our world in the early 1900s, in which science, instead of developing along the lines of physics and chemistry and the other hard sciences that we know, has developed along the lines of medieval alchemy, the weird, esoteric, almost occultist, a pseudoscience from the Middle Ages is a real thing in this world. Alchemists can actually transmute material from one form to another by using certain written formulas and glyphs and symbols. And it is basically this, what students of Brandon Sanderson would call a hard magic system, because it follows this very strict set of guidelines that it stays pretty consistent with throughout the rest of the series. And I could go into it. It's actually a very interesting, very deep kind of system, but what I will tell you up front is the most important rule of alchemy in this world, called the law of equivalent exchange. And it's something that's given to us right up front in that bloody, horrible scene that I showed you guys, in which the narrator clearly states, "Teachings that do not speak of pain have no meaning, because humankind cannot gain anything without first giving something in return." And that is pounded into the reader's head over and over and over again. Hiromu Arakawa makes sure that her readers know, first and foremost, that this is the primary driving force of the universe, that you cannot gain anything without first losing something. In order to give, something must be taken. In order to gain, something must be lost. In order to achieve, something must be sacrificed. And that theme works its way into every single bit of the narrative. Our main characters are these two young brothers on the cover here, Edward and Alphonse Elric. Edward is the older brother in the red coat there, and Alphonse is the armored guy behind him. Now, these two start off as these ordinary kids from this little pastoral village. When they're very young, their father, who was an alchemist himself, leaves the family behind, and their mother soon after dies in a pandemic that sweeps through their part of the country. And they miss their mother so much that they essentially try to bring her back to life. They study their father's alchemical texts from his library, and they learn how to use alchemy themselves. And they attempt to use these alchemical methods that they have learned in order to create a new body for their mother and bring her back to life. The thing is, though, this method, this human transmutation, is not only illegal, it is taboo among alchemists because of some kind of horrible effects that have resulted in every previous attempt at a human transmutation. As can be expected, something goes horribly wrong, and the sacrifices that these brothers made, the materials that they gathered in order to transmute a new body for their mother, were not enough. And the alchemical ritual rebounds on the brothers. Edward, the older brother, ends up losing his left leg, as you saw in the beginning there. And the younger brother, Alphonse, loses his entire body. And the only reason he doesn't die outright is by Edward sacrificing his right arm to seal Alphonse's soul to a suit of armor that they found in their father's study. And so now both brothers have been drastically changed forever. Edward is missing 2 limbs. Al is a soul confined to a suit of armor. And what's worse is that they didn't even succeed in bringing their mother back. The body that they created for her turns into this blubbery mass of flesh and distorted limbs that twitches around for about 2 seconds and then immediately bleeds to death right in front of them. So it's just overall a horrific scene. It's a horrible, horrible backstory for these 2 brothers. But it does have a bright side. Instead of being disheartened by this horrible tragedy, the older brother, Edward Elric, is galvanized into action, and he becomes determined to find a way, alchemical or otherwise, to restore his brother Alphonse's body and restore his own missing limbs. And in order to do so, he signs on for the State Alchemist program. In the country of Amestris, where they live, the government will offer licenses to certain alchemists who can prove their exceptional capabilities. And being a state alchemist comes with all kinds of perks and privileges. They have privileges that no other member of society has. They can basically go wherever they want, do whatever they want. They have complete government funding for their alchemical research and experiments. It's a pretty good gig, but they are answerable to the Amestrian military, and in times of war, they must be deployed as human weapons. Nevertheless, Edward wants to become one of them. He signs on for the program, and he ends up acing all the tests. He is an absolute prodigy when it comes to alchemy, and he becomes the youngest state alchemist in Amestrian history at the age of 12. Now, with all this government backing, Edward decides to set out on a quest to find a cure for him and his brother. But there is still the issue of his missing limbs. And so he also undergoes an extremely painful reconstructive surgery called automail surgery, which attaches 2 full steel mechanical prosthetic limbs to his body. And so 3 years later, where the story actually starts, we see a teenage Edward running around Amestris on adventures looking for a cure for himself and his brother. He has his brother Alphonse by his side, who, as I mentioned, is a soul, a disembodied soul in a suit of armor. So he has his metal limbs, his metal brother, and he has now garnered a reputation for himself as the Fullmetal Alchemist. Roll credits. So yeah, it's this really, really cool sort of steampunk slash gaslamp fantasy premise. And I absolutely love it. But like I said, the tone is all over the place. Despite how dark and violent this series can be, there is a lot of levity. And it comes in the form of some real screwball comedy. And I think if you're not already familiar with that wacky Japanese sense of humor, the jokes in this series won't really land. They won't come off as being charming. They'll just come off as being really obnoxious. And I know a lot of people who have put this series down because the humor put them off fairly early on. Now, I grew up reading manga and watching anime. I kind of understand the Japanese sense of humor. I think a lot of these jokes are actually pretty funny, but I can understand why they wouldn't be. There is one joke in particular that even I get really sick of. Now, Edward, our main character, Edward, is incredibly short. Despite being 15 years old, he is well under 5 feet tall. He wears these big platform boots and these big expensive coats to make himself look taller and more impressive. But if anyone points out how short he is, he will erupt in these explosive, cartoonish tantrums. And at first, it's pretty funny. But after about the 3rd or 4th time, it gets really, really old and boring. And that's something that I don't really appreciate, but it's a running gag that goes on throughout the rest of the series. So I can see how the humor would get on people's nerves. Which ultimately I think is really unfortunate, because there is a lot of really great fantasy world building and character writing in this series that people miss out on that way. I love every single character in this series. Not just the main characters, the side characters, even the background characters are fantastic. Arakawa has a way of imbuing all of her characters, every single one that she draws, with a real sense of life and energy and personality, and it makes you want to read more about them. Now, I know I said that Edward Elric was our main character, but really both of the Elric brothers, Ed and Al, share double duty as the protagonists of this series. They are very deep, interesting characters that work well on their own, but also work really well off of each other. And it's their relationship, their brotherhood in the series that really ties everything together. And when they are together in the story, you're enjoying their camaraderie and the way they bicker with each other. But when they're apart, you want them to get back together. You like seeing them go through different struggles on their own, of course, but there's always that sense that they belong together. They are a team and they work best as a team. And it's a very, very good depiction of a sibling relationship, I think. But the other characters in the series are also fantastic. One of the members of the main cast that has become sort of a fan favorite is Colonel Roy Mustang, who is Edward's superior officer in the Amestrian military. He is the flame alchemist. He specializes in transmuting and conjuring fire, so he's an incredibly powerful alchemist, and he's also a really cool character who gets a lot of great development over the course of the series. And there's also his right hand, his lieutenant, Riza Hawkeye, who is also fantastic. She is a crack shot with basically any weapon she picks up. She always has a cool head no matter what situation she's in. And she's incredibly loyal to the people she cares about. So she's a really, really fun character. There's all kinds of other members of the Amestrian military that are given a lot of good character development. I can't go into all of them or else I'll be here forever. The villains are really interesting as well. The Seven Deadly Sins serve as our primary antagonists for the series. That's not actually what they're called. What they're called is actually a huge spoiler that I won't get into, but I call them the Seven Deadly Sins because they are named after the deadly sins of Catholicism: lust, wrath, gluttony, that kind of thing. And they're really cool. They all have their own alchemy-related powers that are really fun to see in effect throughout the series. And there's also some other side characters, people like Ling and Mei, who are these young nobles from the distant land of Xing, and they're basically in Amestris, traveling around, competing to find the secret of immortality to return to their emperor back home in Xing in order to gain his favor and become next in line for the throne. So there's just a lot of really cool, quirky characters in this series. I didn't even touch on Scar or the Rockbell family or the Curtis family or any of the other military personnel, but just trust me, every single character in this series is great. If they have a name, they're going to be a cool character. The narrative themes of this series are also really, really well done. Like I said, the tone is pretty inconsistent all the way up until maybe volume 12 or so, and it's at that point where the drama is just heightened and the seriousness takes a big level up, and it stays about that consistency until the end of the series. And it's around this time, I think, that Hiromu Arakawa really knew what kind of story she wanted to tell. And it was also around this time where, during the development of the series, she started conducting interviews with real-life military veterans and people from marginalized ethnic groups. And she ended up taking the notes that she took during those interviews, gathering them together, and using them as inspiration for a story arc that appeared in the latter half of Fullmetal Alchemist. Now, this is a huge departure from the major plot. It is a flashback to before the plot of the story even begins, that tells about a war in which several of the adult characters in the story were involved. And I am not kidding when I say that this is some of the hardest hitting emotional storytelling I've ever read in a comic book series. I've read darker and grittier and more gruesome things in comics before, but every time I read the Ishvalan extermination story arc in Fullmetal Alchemist, it really hits me in the gut. There's some really emotionally twisted, messed up stuff going on in this story, and it is very, very poignant. And from that point on, the series gets back to its main story, and it just keeps getting better and better and better. And before you know it, the story is over, and this wild ride has finally come to an end. Lastly, I do want to talk a little bit about Arakawa's art, because after all, this is a comic book series, and the art is pretty important. Now, to start off, Arakawa's art is kind of a rudimentary manga anime style, but there are some things that are very interesting about her style. that really develop into something amazing over the course of the series. And so you start off with something pretty simple that ends up becoming really incredible. Like I said, the series was produced over the course of 10 years, so you do get to see her art style evolve as the chapters go on. And something that I will say, and I know it's something relatively minor, but something that I've always found interesting is that she's very, very good at drawing hands. Something that I think every artist will tell you is that drawing hands is very, very difficult. But Arakawa is well known for drawing very detailed depictions of human hands. As you can see on this front cover for Volume 3, we have a bunch of different hands and a bunch of different poses and positions. She also draws facial expressions really well. I know that most anime and manga have really expressive facial features on their characters, but she does a fantastic job. Her characters always look fantastic. You can always tell exactly what emotion they're supposed to be displaying. And she also draws action very, very well. All of her fight scenes are full of motion. The characters are always in very dynamic poses. They always stand out very well. And your eyes are constantly moving from panel to panel, following the action. It's just awesome stuff. Now, she can be very detailed when she wants to. Early on in the series, when things are a little goofier, a little more comedic, her style is very simple. But as it progresses, and as the series gets more and more serious, you see a lot more details filtering into her art style. And so when she takes her art seriously, there is some really, really good stuff in this series. There are panels that I wish I could blow up and frame and hang on my wall as works of art. They're so good. Now, if you're going to collect the series, there's a couple different ways to go about it. First of all, there are the individual volumes, the tankobon as they're called in Japan. And I will say that I don't know if they still sell the individual volumes in major retailers. They're still readily available online, I think. I think Amazon still sells these. But I have not seen the individual volumes in bookstores in a long time. I will also say that when I was a kid collecting these, Viz Media published them with these shiny metallic covers and spines. Because, of course, it's Fullmetal Alchemist, so you got to have metallic covers. But then in the 2010s, I believe, they changed it up so that the covers and spines just had this flat gray. And that's just not as fun. So that's unfortunate. But yeah, like I said, they're becoming harder and harder to find out in the wild. What you'll find more often are these omnibus editions, these big, floppy trade paperback editions that combine 3 volumes in one. And it's a 27-volume series, so they all are bound up in 3-volume omnibuses. The quality of the paper is not nearly as good as on the individual volumes, but it's a lot cheaper than buying the individuals. And lastly, if you want to get a little lavish with your collecting, there are the Full Metal editions. These are fairly recent editions that are hardcovers. They have a couple color illustrations, I'm pretty sure. And I don't think they are bound up according to the individual volumes. I think they go by chapter number. I could be wrong about that, because I actually don't have any of them in my collection. I need to get on that, because they are really nice. But yeah, those are the 3 different ways to collect the manga series. But that's it, guys. That is my overall review of Fullmetal Alchemist, my very favorite manga series. Let me know in the comments, as usual, have you read Fullmetal Alchemist? What do you think of it? And until next time, as always, guys, farewell and keep reading.
Something evil has been found in the black depths of the watery abyss. Something so ungodly terrible that the human mind can scarcely comprehend its horror. That's right, the elusive exclusive book society has returned. This time, they'll be reviewing John Brunner's eldritch sci-fi thriller, The Atlantic Abomination. Joining them in this harrowing task are 2 distinguished men of science from the British Isles, the Book Thing and News from the Gelding. Will their combined forces be enough to combat this great evil? Will they survive all the unspeakable horror that awaits? Find out February 5th at 1 p.m. Central Time on Pulp Mortem as the elusive exclusive book society goes live. You won't want to miss a single spine-tingling second of it.
getting close.
So you can feel it too, huh?
You mean you can sense his presence or something?
No, I'm a man. I'm good with directions.